There we go. Okay. Hi, SALT community members. Thank you for tuning in on YouTube, on the internet, wherever you are, to hear us in conversation with Professor Samina Raja and Lisa Doi, calling in from Buffalo, New York, and Chicago, Illinois, respectively. This is the final event in our series, Earthbound, which looks at the intersections between land, labor, and migrant justice initiatives and movements across the US and Asian and specifically South Asian diasporas. And so today, what we're going to be talking about is, as we close this mini series up, what can healing really look like for us as people who come from different lands and live on a shared land that has a very violent history? What does it look like for us to be in solidarity with each other, with ourselves, with our ancestors, and with our siblings' ancestors in equal part? And so I'd like to begin just by offering that my name is Shruti. I'm calling in from Lenape-Hoking, which is traditionally Lenape land, also known as Brooklyn here in New York. And I work with SALT to do some community advocacy and facilitate some learning. And here the space kind of is a chance for us to do the both together. And so this past year, especially, I think, as each of us has become more well acquainted with the land that we sit upon and the lands that we come from, we've come to also understand that the relationships between land and labor and migration are really directed by how nation states define them. And so as we sit with this history now and prepare for this rebirth post-quarantine, post-COVID, what are the actions that we can take? And so I'd like to pass it now to Lisa Doi from Tsuru for Solidarity to do a quick little introduction of herself, and then we can go from there.
Thanks so much, and thanks for convening this, and thanks for inviting me. My name is Lisa. I use she, her pronouns, and I'm one of the organizers with Tsuru for Solidarity, which is a national network of progressive Japanese Americans that was really led and founded by Japanese Americans who'd been incarcerated as children. They started organizing in opposition to the use of former Japanese American confinement sites as detention sites today. And as Tsuru has grown, we've started to more broadly organize as an anti-detention and anti-carceral organization. And I'll stop there.
Thank you, Lisa. Samina, would you like to introduce yourself?
Sure. Thank you, Shruti, for convening us. Just delighted to be here. My name, as you can see on the screen, is Samina. I go by she, her, and my formal role is that I am a faculty member at the State University of New York, where I direct a research lab that focuses on the role of local government policy on creating more just and equitable food systems where people have control and ownership over their food systems. I am a Kashmiri American, which means that I also come to my work from that lived perspective, and my work unfolds on the lands of Iroquois Confederacy in the United States, and I'm actually physically right now on Haudenosaunee lands in the state of New York, and really delighted to be in this conversation. Back to you, Shruti.
Thank you, Samina. So that point that you mentioned right now, right? So that coming from Kashmir, which we all know to be occupied territory, and then also thinking about Turtle Island and the lands that the three of us are calling in from, I'd like to ask Lisa and Samina, how do you guys contextualize the relationships with the land that you're currently on and then the land that you and your ancestors may come from?
I'm happy to go first. I think that being a Kashmiri American and being somebody of Kashmiri ancestry demands that I pay attention to the land that I stand on and I work on. So for those of you who might be dialing in and are not aware of what is going on in Kashmir, Kashmir is in South Asia, and it is a community that has been occupied by many successive forces, and people are continuously displaced in varied names, sometimes in the name of development of nation states, and other times in the name of economic development, very narrowly defined. But the long and short of it is that the people who are intimately connected to the land are displaced from it. Indigenous ways of knowing, in my area in particular, is around food. So sovereign ways of being in relationship with the food system are undermined. So given that experience in Buffalo and in the state of New York, I think a lot about the ways in which the relationships existed on land before I arrived, and the work that happened before I came here, and to find ways to connect my work with the work that is ongoing in the community. And I specifically work in the city of Buffalo, which is also a city that it's one of the most segregated cities in the United States. And so I really focus my work in the United States thinking about how my understanding of displacement and dispossession would allow me to be in solidarity with Black communities and Native American communities in the city of Buffalo. So all my professional work is actually in communities of color in the city of Buffalo. I do work in Kashmir too, but I find that until we, in my case, somebody from Kashmir engages with the liberation movements in the United States, my work is only partial. And that I am able to be a better ally and better able to illustrate the challenges and the aspirations of my own people with my partners like Stand with Kashmir, but only when I root them and understand the land on which I am here present. So I'll stop there and come back to it.
Thank you. I think that was a really interesting and thought-provoking response. Maybe on sort of like the flip side answer, when I think about sort of like the history of Japanese America or the history of my family and how my family got to America, it was right around the same time that Japan was beginning this pretty large imperial project across East Asia. And so, on the one hand, that feels like sort of removed from my family's history, but also like very much part of the reason why my family immigrated to the US at the time they did in the late 1800s. And so then like, what does it sort of mean to have a relationship to Japan as well as an imperial power? And then within the context of the United States, I guess I should have started by adding that, I'm calling in from Chicago, which is Potawatomi, Ojibwe, Odawa land, and also home to one of the largest urban Indian communities in the US. And so, what does it mean to be in a land that both historically and currently really has a large population of Indigenous folks here? And then in Chicago, I think one of the sort of interesting parts of Japanese American incarceration history is that it is oddly sort of tied to policies and practices around the Bureau of Indian Affairs and sort of US Indigenous relationships. So the person who ran the War Relocation Authority went on to run the Bureau of Indian Affairs, and several of the confinement sites themselves were actively on reservation land. And then, my family came to Chicago after being removed from their homes in California, then went to Arkansas, where they were incarcerated. And then, really the project of Japanese American incarceration, when you look at sort of the record produced by the US government, was really a project of dispersal, resettlement, and dispersal assimilation. And the hope was that by scattering Japanese Americans across the country enough, they would sort of assimilate into white American society, and it would eliminate this sort of racial problem. And so that's sort of how my family arrived in Chicago. And I think about that sort of history of assimilation and this sort of like enculturating of an assimilationist ideal quite a bit. And then like as someone who, I guess one of the last things I'll say in thinking about sort of my relationship within the city of Chicago is that I live in the same neighborhood that my great grandparents and grandparents and parents lived in. And so what does it mean to sort of like be back in this neighborhood or be in this neighborhood as the fourth generation of my family to live here, but at the same time, it's a place that doesn't quite feel like home. And so that's just something else I'm thinking about.
Yeah, I think that, Lisa, what you just mentioned about like the dissonance, right, between feeling at home in an adopted land versus in an ancestrally present land is very unique. And I think something that within the South Asian diaspora, especially, it's something we talk about. But I think another piece of that question is thinking about whether our relationship to the lands we currently sit on, right, which are occupied indigenous lands, if that relationship is so tense because that violence is not something that's actively discussed, right? And so sometimes I think about why that dissonance feels so sharp in urban spaces compared to rural spaces, and why community care, right, can turn that dissonance into resonance or even harmony. And so my next question for y'all was to think about the ways in which those relationships to the earth are made caring, made compassionate, and what that looks like in your work. So specifically through your engagement with the lands that you come from and the lands that you're on, what care do you see being employed by yourself, by your loved ones, by those you're in movement with, and how has that changed ultimately your relationship with the land that you're on and the lands that you come from?
Yeah, I would say Tsuru thinks healing is really sort of, I think, one of the primary things that we focus on, and thinking about like what is healing, and maybe beyond just the word healing, like what is repair. And so outside of Tsuru, I'm also a graduate student, and I study how to like sort of public memory and how do we remember the past. And I think for me, that's really a question of how do we remember challenging parts of US history, and what does it mean to then not just remember, but repair and redress, and sort of heal in a historical sense. And I think that's very much part of the work Tsuru does, but in the Tsuru angle from more of a community-based collective sort of care, healing, and repair. And I think there are sort of many directions and many forms that can take. One of which is sort of the form of direct action, and that by engaging in direct action in solidarity with other communities, that this can be a very healing and repairing way to build relationships. But I think there are just, a lot of other forms it can take. And I think one of them that we're talking about as we can sort of re-emerge from being really isolated is like, what does it mean to share food together? What does it mean to have meals together? And so how can we start reintegrating that kind of practice into some of the work we're doing? And partially that's also like, how do we share recipes that our families have carried, and affirm those people who didn't have or haven't been able to inherit those kinds of recipes, to build and create new kinds of things together.
I love the turn towards food, Lisa. I'm going to continue on that thread, if I may. It's a great question, Shruti. There's a sense of deep loss in my life around Kashmir that's really difficult to, in some ways, intellectualize, because it doesn't lend itself to that easily. But that said, one of the things that I found important in my own practice, and if it's at all helpful, is to understand that for me and more broadly, as part of a movement and a community, including folks in Stand with Kashmir, that for me, food, actually the art of growing food and preserving it and cooking it is an act of resistance, and it's an act of justice, and it's an act of restoration. And until we address resistance and justice and restoration, we really can't reach the healing part. So for me, what it has looked like is I work with an indigenous green called the hawk. It's grown in Kashmir. It's from the collard family. And I work with small scale growers who grow hawk as a way to provide a solidarity to Kashmiris in times of curfew and conflict, when people cannot go to the grocery store and feed themselves, when curfew is on and there are shoot and sight orders. So basically local farmers and people who themselves grow hawk sustain themselves. So it's an act of self-preservation, if you will. And in the United States, I was talking to a friend about the importance of greens in Black communities and what food represents as an act of resistance and continuing your history and demanding attention to your stories and lifting them up. I found that connecting the thread between how growing food and getting your hands into the earth is a form of resistance. So I am very focused on hawk, which sounds really strange because it's such an ordinary thing, but to me super powerful, that in Kashmir, the act of growing hawk can be like the act of growing freedom. And then the way that has translated for me in Buffalo is I'm really lucky to work with a caucus of Black and brown growers and people working on food sovereignty. And there's an elder in the community by the name of Gail Wells. I hope she hears this conversation at some point. She brings both the Black and Indigenous tradition in her life. And she is the founder of something called the Freedom Garden Movement. So it's called the Buffalo Freedom Gardens, and she encourages and supports and lifts up people's ability to grow their own fruits and vegetables as an act of liberation. So this is not an act of healthy eating, if you will, but rather, how do we become sovereign and one with the earth and what it has to offer us? And to me, being in relationship with her and being part of the Freedom Garden Project in Buffalo was a way of continuing my own personal journey about looking at food as resistance from Kashmir to Buffalo. So for me, the act of growing and knowing where your food comes from is a part of that. And learning how people grow and where it came from and what grew on the land before I arrived is important. And so was just so delighted to hear Lisa talk about cooking together as well.
If I could also piggyback on what you're saying, I mean, I think this is just like, it's making me think in a lot of different directions. But I really like this idea of both, how do we identify and name acts of resistance, which maybe are not in the traditionally conceived of definition of what resistance is, and then also like what can't be communicated in an intellectualized way. And I think, on the resistance part, like, I think the fact that I got to grow up in Chicago with a strong Japanese American community in a Buddhist temple, with all these sort of things that made me feel very tethered to an ethnic community, that maybe weren't being, like, the people who started them were not thinking of it as radical. In the context in which it was developed, to me, it feels very radical, this desire to sort of preserve and pass on Japanese American traditions. And that similarly, like, we're not going to win everyone over with the idea that they're coming to like an intergenerational healing conversation. But like, what if we cook together, or what if we do something else together? What if we dance together? That those things can be things that are also part of that healing and repair process, that maybe don't get called out as healing and repair, but that are so essential to being able to both heal and repair, but also like further open doors to future possibilities.
May I follow up? 100% agree with you, Lisa. And if I could lift it up by saying that I think that until we know how to carry stories forward, we can't see each other fully. So I think part of the way in which nation states have been able to polarize people, or neoliberal systems have been able to polarize people, because they have been so successful at reducing people to their one extractive function. Whereas what you are describing is demanding that we see each other in our fullness. So whereas for my an ant, the act of growing hawk is so ordinary, but it is so powerful that it demands that people pay attention to where that hawk comes from, what it means, why isn't it exported, why is it an indigenous crop. All of those stories demand that people and communities see her as a full person. So I just love that what might seem as ordinary is actually a really powerful practice of resistance. So thank you for lifting that.
I think that's such a beautiful thing to think about, especially as I, move towards the next question, which was going to ask, how can we being in solidarity or being united in resilience, right, with people who we may not share ancestral lands with, but share either adopted lands with, or just, humanness and that internal song with. What does that solidarity look like? And so I guess in addition to that question is, are there moments of these, everyday resilience, seconds or minutes, that you see other communities reflected in? And if you could dream of a day filled with these moments, right, what would that day look like? How do you embody solidarity in every single act? How do you embody or realize solidarity and its presence in every single act that you inherently are going to do in every day? Because I think that's what our ancestors, in the lands that we come from, and the ancestors of our siblings and our neighbors, right? That's how they've survived and thrived and embodied and like imbued land with love. And so I'm curious what the process for recognizing that could look like for each of us, for our communities, both as, Asians, South Asians, as Indigenous people, and as occupiers of Indigenous land. So yeah.
It was a whole series of really great questions. So maybe I'll just start somewhere and then we can see where we go from there. I think what it's making me think about, so right now is sort of like a festival season called Obon, or it's called Obon. And then there are sort of dances that you do within Obon. It's also sort of like a religious holiday, but it's a time when ancestors come back to visit the earth. And so, for 3 days, like, ancestors return to visit family and friends and loved ones. And just in general, like, Tsuru as an intergenerational organizing space, I think a lot about, like, what does it mean to be in relationship across generations, both generations of people who are still alive and generations of people who have passed away. But what you're asking is making me think about, like, what does it mean to be, if I think I can be in relationship with my own ancestors, and if I think I can be in relationship with other people who are, sharing space with me or ideas with me, like, is there a way for sort of like that kind of relationship across time to occur across communities as well? So that's just like initially what I've been starting to think about. And how do we have sort of the time and space to get to have those kind of small scale celebrations? So actually, like, picking back up on Obon, I went to my temple for services yesterday. There's sort of usually a big Obon service. And one of the stories that we were hearing about was the story about like one of the students of the Buddha who was asked to like plan a festival, but at the same time, his mom was really ill. And so the Buddha asked him to plan this festival without thinking about his mother. And, you know, he couldn't do it. He struggled, and then was really disappointed that he like wasn't able to put his mother out of his mind. And he started joining in the dance. And just for a split second, you know, he was able to put his mother out of his mind. And in that moment, like he could experience just this feeling of pure joy. And so I think like it's just been making me think about like how do you get those like small moments of joy, and what does that feel like, and what can kind of inculcate that experience. So I know that was like a series of very disjointed and maybe nonsensical thoughts, but that's what I was thinking about in response to your question.
It's a good question, and what a great reflection, Lisa. I'll be thinking about that story. So what does that day look like where we are in solidarity with the communities on which we work, live? Sometimes it's a complicated one, I think. I think for me, from a personal and professional, they are two related but distinct practices. On the personal front, I do absolutely have to retreat into the mountains. And for where I am from and who I am, I have to, there's something about from where I am from Kashmir, the stories like the one that you're describing, Lisa, for your family is important for me. So there's a saying in Kashmir, Yel poshe van, tel poshe an, which means without forests, there will be no food. And so for me, a retreat to the forest and being able to be in that space has been super important. But at the same time, I also recognize that my access to those forests is completely challenged and threatened by the policies that are dispossessing forest dwellers as we speak. So, you know, elderly women in Kashmir who are forest dwellers are being asked to leave. So I have this conflict and tension, whereas personally, I want to retreat to the forest. I also know actively from a policy front that people are being removed from their lands, from the forests. So here I am. Actually, I'm sitting in a forest right now. This is not a virtual screen. And this is sort of maybe unexplained forces of the universe, but I actually came to the Adirondacks mountains because somebody said that if you go into the Adirondacks, you might feel that you are in Kashmir, because I was not able to go back after 2019 because of the political situation, and there's a lot going on. So I feel like my homelands have been torn from me, and I'm searching for them wherever I can go personally. But of course, I've also experienced being told to leave mountains and wilderness areas in the United States as a brown person. So it's not safe to hike or find home in the United States as a South Asian person, brown person, Black person. So there's this tension that I need this. This is where I belong, but that to which I belong is no longer one that I can access. So I feel completely dislocated. So that's kind of the personal practice piece. But at the same time, I think I've come to a place where in order to reclaim that, I must engage in policy. That for me, healing is no longer about individual practice anymore. And so while I can still recover and find care for myself by doing what I did today, I actually spent 4 hours on the mountain, and you can hear the birds in the background, but that is insufficient to be in solidarity and to be in practice for what I need to do. And so for me, I would suggest that for our siblings and communities that we work with, a really important practice is to study the history, to really study why things are the way they are, and then action can follow. So weirdly, I don't have a set of prescriptions of what you must do, but more like what are the questions you must ask and what is it that you must know before you dare to act or suggest that you want to act in solidarity with somebody. I think that as an immigrant in the United States, it's really important for me to learn about what is happening in the United States in Black neighborhoods, what's happening on indigenous lands, in order for me to be in solidarity. That was a long-winded answer to your question, Shruti.
It touched on everything that I was thinking about, right? For me, the immediate thought I think about when you're where you are right now, right, in the forest, what are the individual elements that remind you of Kashmir and being home, and how do they arrive, right? And how, when we understand or learn histories of siblings, ancestors, of our own ancestors, how do we identify these elements of ourselves in there, and how is empathy a part of that healing process? And then I'm also thinking about, right, the question, and this is the final question, was about for the lands that we don't have relationship with, right? How are we in solidarity with them, right? So for me, I have lived in on occupied Turtle Island for my entire life with ancestral ties to South Asia, but my solidarity with Palestine just means as much as my solidarity with Kashmir. And so how do I understand what it means to embody love, to embody care, solidarity in my body when I don't necessarily know the nuance or the context of what, Palestine looks like, but I know in my body what that looks like. And so I guess this final reflection is, right, what does it, for you, what does the world where we're in this moment of mental transnational solidarity without losing connection to the lands that we're on, what does that mean to you, look like to you, is my question.
I'm happy to take a crack at it and again, it comes very much from being a Kashmiri American, and really that's kind of the place I speak from. So when I am moving through a place, including this forest, I am constantly asking about who belongs here, and then who decided who belongs here. And then, of course, because I'm in local government policy, how do structures decide to police bodies and particular people here? And on the surface of it, when I visited the Adirondacks, I immediately noticed the ways in which this leaf reminds me of home and how it is different. So for those of you who have connections to Kashmir, this looks like a chinar leaf, but it is actually not. I spent some time learning today that this is a kind of maple, and I believe this is a sugar maple because it has a U crevice in the leaf. The point being, so that's the ecology of a place looking for threads. But then I also learned that this is not far from where John Brown's farm was, where the effort to be in work around abolition was happening. And so every place, every land, every spot on this earth, whether it's Kashmir or whether it's this Haudenosaunee land that I'm sitting on, Palestine. I think that remembering the people with the land and finding out and being in conversation and relationship with people, very much like you are doing right here, I think is important. I fear in the context of Kashmir that places are understood as disconnected from people, and that they are primarily understood as extraction, as a source of extraction, as a place where development projects unfold, where a particular idea of development is being foisted, and resisting that and engaging in political conversations about what that means. So in the US context, I talked to my fellow Kashmiri Americans about the importance of organizing in the city of Buffalo around our first socialist mayor in the United States, India Walton, for those of you who don't know. So why organizing for India is I don't want to say no different, but it's important, and it's the same thread as the conversation that is happening around organizing for Kashmir. So understanding those structures of oppression that polarize us and prevent us from being in relationships of love with the earth and the people, I think that is made more possible when we don't pay attention to those political structures. So for me, that act of radical love requires that we pay attention to those larger structures, regardless of where we are. I hope that makes sense.
Yeah, thank you. It's just a very delightful conversation. And Shruti, one of your questions, or one of the words you used was like, something in your, or a phrase, something in your body. And it sort of made me think about, I often want the words dismember and remember to share the same etymology, but they don't. But I still think they're very sort of like twinned words. And that like remembrance is an act of sort of coming back. For me, remembrance is an act of coming back into your body as well. And so like how do you really actualize sort of embodied knowledge in practice? Because I think often embodied knowledge for me is stuff that is hard to put into words. So then how do I sort of share that with other people other than getting out and doing things together? But then I'm also sort of thinking back to some of the conversations we've had about history and knowing history. And I think one of my questions is like, what history is intentionally hidden, and why, and then how do you sort of learn about those histories? So I'm talking to a friend who's doing research in Arkansas about sort of like there are these many moments of sort of Asian American history in Arkansas that just totally fly under the radar. And so like, how do you sort of unearth that? And again, sort of turning back to Japanese American history, a lot of the sites where Japanese Americans were confined have these multiple histories across communities as either sites of confinement or incarceration, or sometimes not, sometimes sort of like sites that were beneficial for one group and not for another group. So I was just learning yesterday about the Colorado River Indian tribes and how the Bureau of Indian Affairs did a land use study in 1940 that determined that this community was underutilizing their land. And so first they brought Japanese Americans in to sort of use some of that space, and then they sort of forced other Native communities to move onto this land and become part of the Colorado River Indian tribe because the Bureau of Indian Affairs felt like it was underutilized. And so what happens when sort of multiple communities are crossing paths on the same land? Maybe not literally because there's temporal gaps, but how do you sort of really thoughtfully bring those communities into conversation? Because I think one of the other challenges there in particular is, can you preserve multiple communities' histories on the same site? And how do you really do that well? And then the final thing I'll say, I was in a conference last week on different organizers who are organizing around abolition. And one person was talking about, we can't build monuments to prisons, and pointing particularly to Alcatraz as sort of this like really odd site where, it was once a prison and now it's this museum that's sort of also a tourist destination. And there were a lot of pieces of that I really resonated with, this idea that like you can't build monuments to prisons. And I was also sort of grappling with like, what do we, a lot of the work that I do thinks about how Japanese Americans memorialize incarceration sites. Or my great grandmother died while she was being confined in Arkansas. So what do I do with this land that's not my land, that I don't really, I've been to, but don't have deep relationship with, but it's also the like grave site of my great grandmother, but it's also this confinement site. And so like, I just was really grappling with like, what do we do or not do regarding sort of memorializing and remembering land, and particularly when that remembrance has to be in community with other folks. How do we really ensure that that can be done well, and in a way that's mutually respectful?
Yeah, I mean, I think the remembrance piece, right, is for me where we can, I mean, I think in dialogues like this, right, not that this is the be all end all, right, like Samina, you mentioned, but that this is a seed for the types of love and change, that being in dialogue is one way to kickstart that process of becoming earthbound once again. And then I think another thing that I think about is when we think about the lands and how they hold these histories, for me, when you mentioned the sugar maples, right? Or if I think about tomatoes and chilies and other, foods that have quite literally traversed the earth, and how they have become memorials, right? Of our communities, and how tending to them almost feels like a way to understand those, those dichotomous histories of both healing and harm, and to hold them together and then with them produce some action, right? To make a curry with chilies and tomatoes feels loving for that very reason, because not only does it taste amazing, but also because it speaks to the fact that my community has come from different places, and I live in a place where other communities have come together to be. And in this plate, we're all represented. And in that seed, in that branch, in that leaf, we all have, this capacity to really be intimate with each other in a different way. And I think for me, it's a form of care that I'd like to see better embodied in all of our work that we do, right? Whether it's in, these policy advocacy spaces, whether it's in graduate school or other parts of academia, or whether it's in the nonprofit space, right? Where are the tomatoes? Where are the chilies? And like, how do we water them and provide them sunlight, and also know when it's time to harvest them and feed off of them? And so I think Tsuru for Solidarity and Stand with Kashmir are communities that know how to do this with such critical compassion that it feels intrinsic almost to the way that you guys think about each other and the people that you work with. And I just want to say thank you for offering your reflections, and for bringing that forth in your work too, right? To seed those plants, metaphorically and literally, I think is incredibly important work, and quite literally seeding, again, the work that I do and folks younger than I do. And so I'm just very grateful for both of you and for your organizations, and for our shared Zoom session today.
Yeah, thank you so much. It's been really great to be in dialogue with both of you.
Ditto, this is enjoyable, and I'll be thinking about the tomatoes and the curry for sure. If I could extend that metaphor for a minute more, I think one of the things that I also would, I just want to be clear that care and love also requires knowing when to put an end to things. It also requires weeding out harm and having the courage to put an end to that too. And I just wanted to be sure to say that there are times when that must end. And I was struck by an example that Lisa gave about the land use plan. So I'm going to share this one little anecdote about it's a land use policy can really be a lever for destruction, says the urban planner. In the city of Srinagar in Kashmir, there is more land under quote unquote defense use than under public health, public service use. So controlling bodies is more important as a land use category than food sovereignty, for example. And in the US, in local governments, a bigger portion of the budget is put into quote unquote public safety. It is not, it's police, and almost negligible on the kinds of care activities that we are discussing, like food. So I want to make sure that we also talk about how healing and repair also requires acts of putting an end to that which must be ended, that is harmful to our communities through structures and policies.
Yeah.
Stop.
Yes, I love that. I mean, harvesting, right? That's, for me, that's knowing when the tomatoes need to be picked or knowing when a blight has happened, and being able to recover, again, with that care, with that love for each other, right? For the plants that have these budding fruits with potential. I don't know, I've been falling in love with this little garden metaphor, and Lisa and I have talked about our love for farms and all that they carry in representing healing and unity and compassion. And so I'm grateful to have these new analogies to apply to the seedlings on my windowsill. For those of you watching online, thank you so much for tuning in. From your seats at home, please thank Samina and Lisa for joining us as well. I'll be sure to share some information on the organizations they work with and their own personal work. And if you'd like to stay tuned, be sure to follow SAALT on Twitter and Instagram, or learn more about SAALT at salt.org. Thank you for tuning in.